There is a particular kind of silence that follows the end of a marriage, not the quiet of a peaceful house, but the kind that settles into the walls like smoke after a fire, the kind that makes a woman stand in her own hallway and not recognize the life she built. Renee Caldwell knew that silence well, because she had been living inside it for exactly 11 days when her phone rang at 7:40 in the morning and a voice she had never heard before said, "You don't know me, but I think you need to know what your husband just did." She almost hung up. She had trained herself, in those 11 days, to expect nothing good from unexpected calls. But something, instinct, or maybe the quiet rage that had been building in her chest like pressure behind a dam, made her press the phone to her ear and listen. What she heard in the next 4 minutes would not break her. It would rebuild her into something her husband never saw coming. Dear friends, welcome, and I'm so glad you're here for this one. If you're new to this channel, this is where real human stories live, the ones that make you grip your phone a little tighter and forget you were supposed to be doing something else. Please subscribe right now, hit that notification bell, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about strength today. Now settle in, because what Warren Caldwell did to his wife, and what happened exactly 24 hours after he left, is one of the most remarkable things I have ever had the privilege of telling. Renee was 44 years old, and she had, by every reasonable measure, done everything a woman is supposed to do to build a good life. She had married Warren at 22, followed him to Columbus, Ohio when his career demanded it, quietly shelved her own ambition to join a top-tier real estate firm in Chicago so that he could stay close to his parents during his father's illness, and spent 2 decades constructing a life that was solid, warm, and real. She ran her own real estate practice out of a small office on Henderson Road. Nothing flashy, but respected. Her clients called her back. Her neighbors trusted her. She was the woman on Clearwater Drive who brought food when someone had surgery and remembered every child's birthday on the block. She was not a woman who fell apart. She had never needed to learn how. The warning signs had been there for 8 months, and she had translated each one into something harmless with the unconscious skill of a woman who has too much invested to see clearly. Warren's phone migrated from their shared nightstand to his office desk sometime in February, always face down, always muted. He started taking calls in the garage and coming back inside with the careful neutrality of someone who has just rehearsed his own expression. He stopped initiating conversation at dinner and started filling the silence with television, which he had never particularly liked before. None of these things were proof of anything. They were weather patterns, shifts in pressure, the kind a loving wife notices but refuses to name, because naming something gives it power, and some women are not yet ready to give that particular thing any power at all. Sandra Marsh had moved back to Columbus from Phoenix the previous April. She and Warren had grown up 3 streets apart in Westerville, and the history between them was old enough that Renee had never feared it. Warren himself had told the story at dinner parties over the years with the easy detachment of a man recounting a high school sports injury, something that had once hurt but had healed cleanly. Sandra had been the one who got away, briefly, at 19. Warren had moved on. He had found Renee. That was the story as Renee knew it, and for 22 years it had been true. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Sandra's return to Columbus had not been coincidental, and that the backyard barbecue where she and Warren reconnected in May had not been the accident that Warren later described it as when Renee, suspicious and exhausted, had finally asked him directly in August. He had looked her in the eye and said, "She's just an old friend. You're being paranoid." And because she loved him, and because 22 years is a long time to doubt a man, she had believed him. He left on a Wednesday. Not a dramatic Wednesday. Not a Wednesday with a storm outside or a song on the radio that would have made it feel cinematic and deliberate. A plain, gray Wednesday in October, when the leaves on the oak in the front yard were turning rust-colored and the air smelled like wood smoke from someone's fireplace down the street. He sat across from Renee at the kitchen table, and he told her with the careful, emotionally managed tone of a man who had rehearsed the conversation many times that he was leaving, that he and Sandra had reconnected, that he had realized, over the past several months, that what he felt for Sandra was something he had never fully let go of. He used the phrase, unfinished business, and Renee would spend weeks afterward hating those two words more than any others in the English language. He was not cruel about it. He did not raise his voice. He told her he respected her, that she deserved to know the truth, that he hoped they could handle the divorce like adults. Then he stood up, picked up a bag she now realized had been packed and sitting in the garage for days, and walked out of the house on Clearwater Drive for the last time. Renee sat at that kitchen table for 3 hours without moving. She did not call her sister. She did not cry. She stared at the grain of the wood on the table's surface, a table she had picked out herself at an estate sale in Granville, refinished by hand over a long weekend, and she felt something shift inside her that she could not name yet. It was not grief, though grief was there underneath it. It was not rage, though rage was building. It was something older and quieter than both, the slow, tectonic movement of a woman deciding, without fully realizing she is deciding, exactly who she is going to become. Warren moved into Sandra's apartment on Livingston Avenue that same evening. He had, it turned out, already transferred a significant portion of their joint savings, $43,000, into a personal account 3 weeks prior, citing a business investment that Renee had not questioned because she had trusted him. She discovered the transfer on Thursday morning when she sat down with their bank statements and made herself look at every number on every page, the way a doctor examines an X-ray, searching for what she had been avoiding. The $43,000 was gone. The business investment did not exist. And there, in the cold arithmetic of a spreadsheet, was the true nature of what Warren had done, not just an emotional betrayal, but a calculated financial one, planned and executed while he was still sleeping in their bed and eating dinner at their table and telling her she was paranoid. She called a lawyer that afternoon. His name was Dennis Holt, and he was 61 years old, semi-retired, and the kind of attorney who had seen everything and could not be rattled by anything. He listened to Renee for 45 minutes without interrupting, then said, "The money transfer alone is enough to change the terms of this divorce significantly. Don't move anything. Don't confront him. Don't let him know what you know." She wrote down every word. Then she went home, made herself dinner, and sat at the kitchen table again. But this time she had a legal pad in front of her, and she was writing things down. Now this is where you need to pay close attention, because the story is about to turn in a direction that nobody, not Warren, not Sandra, not even Renee herself, could have predicted. That phone call on Friday morning, the one from the voice she didn't recognize, came from a woman named Patricia. Patricia was 41, sharp-voiced, and direct, and she explained in the first 30 seconds that she worked at the same Columbus property management company as Sandra Marsh. She had heard through a co-worker that Sandra was celebrating a new relationship with a man who had just left his wife, and the story had spread through the office the way these things do. Patricia didn't know Renee, but she had been through a divorce of her own 3 years earlier under circumstances she described only as familiar, and something in her would not let it go unaddressed. "I don't have proof of anything," Patricia said, "but I've been watching Sandra at work for 6 months, and there are things about her situation you should probably understand before this divorce gets too far along." Renee pulled out the legal pad. "Tell me everything," she said. What Patricia described was not a love story. It was an architecture. Sandra Marsh had returned to Columbus not on impulse, but on calculation. She had left Phoenix following the collapse of a relationship with a man named Gregory who had been, according to Patricia, considerably wealthy and had ended things in a way that left Sandra with nothing but the clothes she could pack in 2 days. Sandra had come back to Columbus specifically because it was familiar ground, because she knew people there, and because she had a particular talent, which Patricia described with the flat precision of someone who had watched it up close. for identifying men who were stable, slightly restless, and emotionally available enough to be redirected. Warren Caldwell, a successful civil engineer with a paid-off house, a solid retirement account, and a high school crush he had never fully processed, was, in Sandra's world, not a love story. He was a landing pad. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story, because the most important part is just beginning. Renee did not feel vindicated by what Patricia told her. She felt something colder and more useful than vindication. She felt informed. There is a difference between a woman who is heartbroken and a woman who is heartbroken and thinking clearly. And in the 2 weeks following Warren's departure, Renee Caldwell had crossed that line without ceremony and without announcement. She met with Dennis Holt again on Monday. She brought the bank statements, a printed record of Warren's phone activity from their shared cellular plan, which he had forgotten was still in her name, and a quiet, methodical account of every financial decision Warren had made in the previous 8 months that she could now see, in retrospect, had been preparatory. The phone records alone were extraordinary. 372 calls or texts to Sandra's number between May and October, many of them placed after midnight, from inside the house on Clearwater Drive, while Renee slept in the room down the hall. Dennis reviewed everything slowly, then looked up at her over his reading glasses. "He made mistakes," he said simply. "Several of them." Renee nodded. "I know," she said. "I need you to make sure none of them disappear." Dennis smiled for the first time since she had walked into his office. "That," he said, "I can absolutely do." Now here is where the 24 hours comes in, because while Renee was building her case with the careful, unhurried patience of a woman who understood that the best revenge is not the fastest one, something was already happening on Livingston Avenue that Warren Caldwell had not anticipated, could not have anticipated, and that would alter the entire landscape of what he believed he had walked into. Sandra Marsh, it turned out, was not alone in her life. She had not told Warren this. She had presented herself as unattached, newly settled, a woman reclaiming her story after a hard few years. What she had not mentioned was Marcus Cole. Marcus was 47, originally from Atlanta, and he had been in Sandra's life, quietly, consistently, on his own terms, for the better part of 14 months. He was not a secret, exactly. He was more of an inconvenience that Sandra had chosen not to address before Warren arrived. Marcus was a real estate investor with properties in Columbus, Cincinnati, and Louisville, patient, observant, and not the kind of man who discovered he had been managed without responding to it with precision. Marcus found out about Warren not through Sandra, but through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it at a property walkthrough on a Thursday afternoon with the innocent, offhand carelessness of someone who assumed Marcus already knew. He did not react in the moment. He thanked the acquaintance, finished the walkthrough, got in his car, and sat quietly for several minutes. Then he made 2 phone calls. The first was to his attorney. The second was to Renee Caldwell, whose name he had found, with minimal effort, through public property records attached to Warren's home address on Clearwater Drive, because Marcus Cole was the kind of man who believed in understanding the full dimensions of a situation before he moved inside it. When Renee's phone rang that Friday morning, and she heard a voice she didn't recognize, it was Marcus. Not Patricia, though Patricia would call later that same day, separately, with her own account from inside Sandra's office. It was Marcus who called first. And what Marcus said, in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who had spent 2 decades making decisions with incomplete information and learning to be comfortable with that, was this: "Mrs. Caldwell, I think we may have a shared problem, and I think we may be able to solve it together, if you're willing to have an honest conversation." Renee had been awake since 5 in the morning. She was on her 2nd cup of coffee and her 3rd page of legal notes. She looked out the window at the rust-colored oak in the front yard and said, "I'm listening." What followed over the next 72 hours was not a romance. Let that be perfectly clear. It was an alliance, built between two people who had each been treated as furniture in someone else's story and had separately arrived at the same conclusion, that they were not furniture, and that the people who had mistaken them for such were about to find that out. Marcus had documentation of his own, financial agreements with Sandra, a shared investment in a rental property on the east side of Columbus that Sandra had quietly begun transferring paperwork on, attempting to position herself as the sole owner now that Warren had appeared and Marcus, she apparently assumed, could be eased out. It was the same instinct, the same architecture Patricia had described: identify the asset, isolate it, acquire it. Sandra Marsh had simply made the mistake of running the same play on two very different men at the same time without checking whether those men might eventually compare notes. Dennis Holt, when Renee brought Marcus's documentation into their next meeting alongside her own, sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something Renee would remember for the rest of her life. "She didn't just take your husband," he said. "She tried to take his assets, your assets, and Marcus's assets simultaneously. And she was going to let Warren believe he was in a love story while it happened." He shook his head slowly. "Some people," he said, "confuse patience and others for blindness." The divorce proceedings moved swiftly once Dennis filed the full documentation: the unauthorized transfer of $43,000, the phone records, the evidence of financial concealment, the timeline that demonstrated premeditation rather than spontaneous romantic reconnection. Warren, who had walked into this expecting a cooperative, grief-stricken wife who would sign papers and disappear quietly, found himself instead looking at a legal document that recharacterized his transfer of funds as dissipation of marital assets, which under Ohio law carried significant consequences for the settlement terms. His own attorney called him on a Tuesday, the same day of the week he had once imagined this would all be tidily resolved, and told him the situation had changed substantially. Warren asked how substantially. His attorney paused, then said, "The house, the retirement account, and potentially a civil claim on the transferred funds. She has everything documented." Warren was silent for a long time. Then he said, "She didn't know about any of this." His attorney said quietly, "She knows now." But the financial reckoning was only half of it, and in some ways, the lesser half. The part that Warren had not seen coming, could not have seen coming because it required understanding Sandra in a way he had refused to do, was Marcus. Marcus did not file anything dramatic. He did not make scenes. What Marcus did was retrieve, through entirely legal channels and with his attorney's guidance, the property documentation Sandra had been quietly repositioning, restore his name to those agreements, and in doing so expose a paper trail of Sandra's behavior that was now visible not only to her employer, but to the Columbus property management community, which was smaller and more interconnected than Sandra had apparently calculated. Within 3 weeks of Warren's departure from Clearwater Drive, Sandra Marsh had been asked to resign from her position at the property management company following an internal review of documents that had been brought to HR's attention. Her professional reputation in Columbus, the city she had returned to as her safe ground, her rebuilding place, was gone before Warren had finished moving his second box into her apartment. Warren found out about Sandra's resignation on a Thursday afternoon when he came home to find her sitting on the couch in a particular kind of stillness that he recognized, with a lurch, as familiar. It was the same stillness Renee had carried in those final months, the stillness of a person managing information they hadn't yet decided what to do with. He asked her what happened. She told him. He asked if she had known about Marcus. She was quiet for a moment too long. And in that silence, Warren Caldwell felt the specific, nauseating sensation of a man who has burned down his own house to stand in a field that turns out to be someone else's and is now on fire. He called Renee that evening. She did not answer. He called the next morning. She did not answer then either. On the third call, she picked up, and before he could say anything, she said, simply and without venom, "Dennis will handle everything from here, Warren." Please don't call this number again." Then she hung up. She did not slam the phone down. She set it carefully on the counter, the way you set down something that no longer has any weight. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. The settlement reflected the full documentation Dennis had filed. The house on Clearwater Drive remained with Renee. The retirement account was divided with terms significantly favorable to her, and the $43,000 was recovered in full through the civil claim. Warren left the settlement with considerably less than he had arrived with, and considerably more understanding of what he had thrown away. He and Sandra remained together for another 7 weeks after her resignation, which surprised some people and surprised no one who had been paying attention, because when the architecture collapses, the people standing inside it tend to look at each other in the rubble and realize they were never actually building the same thing. Marcus Cole called Renee once more after the divorce was finalized, a brief, professional call to let her know his own legal matters had concluded cleanly and to wish her well. She thanked him. He said, "You handled this with a lot of grace." She thought about that for a moment. "I handled it with a lot of notes," she said. He laughed. It was the first time in 4 months she had heard herself laugh too. They did not meet for coffee. They did not become friends. They were two strangers who had briefly stood at the same intersection and chosen the same direction, and then walked on separately, which was exactly the right ending for that particular chapter. Renee sold 2 properties in the first quarter after the divorce closed, her strongest quarter in 3 years. She had the kitchen table from the estate sale in Granville refinished again, not because it needed it, but because she wanted to. She stood in the house on Clearwater Drive one evening in early March, when the light through the west-facing windows turned everything amber and warm, and she looked at the rooms she had designed, the walls she had chosen, the details that were entirely hers, and she felt something she had not expected to feel so soon. Not happiness exactly, not triumph, something quieter and more durable than either. She felt like herself, more herself, actually, than she had been in years, because it is a strange and terrible gift, the moment you realize that the life you were afraid to lose was already more yours than you knew. Warren Caldwell was last known to be renting an apartment in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus. He attends a men's Bible study on Tuesday mornings, which the people who know him say he started 6 months after the divorce. Nobody who knows Renee talks about this with her, and she has never asked. There is a certain kind of woman who, when the ground disappears beneath her, does not fall. She builds something new under her own feet before she finishes the fall. Renee Caldwell was that kind of woman. She just hadn't needed to prove it yet. And the man who left her on a plain, gray Wednesday in October, with a packed bag in the garage and the word unfinished on his lips, had done the one thing he had no idea he was doing. He had finally gotten out of her way. Friends, if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know or something you've lived through, please like this video right now and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below. I want to know what moment in this story hit you the hardest. Was it when Renee sat at that kitchen table alone? Was it the phone call from Marcus? Was it that final line? Tell me. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because every week we bring you stories like this one, real, raw, and human. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a single one. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. That tells me everything I need to know about you.